And today, this happens to be on a Thursday. Those of you know that your holiday, although we know entrepreneurs don't get holidays typically. But for those of you who are not in Kenya, thank you all for understanding and shifting to today. It's wonderful to see all of you. And we're very excited today to have our focus around building organizational capacity. So over the past 2 weeks, we've really focused on what it takes to strengthen or to sort of understand the needs of funders, to think about building sort of your organization so that you are attractive to funders if that's the route that you need to go, to think about what growth means and what are some of the structures for your business that could help you to be successful. We're now shifting over the next 2 weeks to really thinking about what are the internal structures within your organization that need to be in place for you to be successful, right? So often, and I know Tonya will speak to this, as entrepreneurs, we focus so much on the product that we don't always focus on our team, on making sure we have the right people hired, and thinking about what it really takes to make a successful organization. And so we want to spend the next 2 weeks thinking about what your organization needs to be successful. Tonya will be kicking off this cycle of learning and bringing sort of a focus around how do you build organizational capacity? What does that actually mean? How do you think about who are the right people to hire? When do you hire them? What does it mean to invest early on in building capacity? And how does that sort of pay off long term as you think about a desire to grow and scale your impact? Why is it so important to get your sort of house in order before that happens? So that is the focus of today. Tonya, of course, feel free to add and strengthen what I've shared. But we're very excited to have you here. And of course, there are guests that are not part of the BimaLab Accelerator, so please feel free just to share a bit about yourself as well before we dive into today's session.
Okay, thank you very much. My plan is to share my video and to hope that Safaricom doesn't let me down. So good afternoon or good evening, everybody. My name is Tonya Kariuki, or Tonya Mutiso Kariuki, depends on what mood I'm in. It's a pleasure to be here today. For the BimaLab startups that are in the BimaLab Accelerator, I know I've had the pleasure of meeting pretty much everybody and a number of your team members. And so welcome again. It's been a while since we spoke. And for the other people on the call, it's a pleasure to meet you all too. And I hope that today is really worthwhile for you. So I figured maybe I'd start off with a bit of an introduction on who I am. So I currently run Holistic Technology Services, which is an interesting company, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But let me start a little bit historically speaking. So by training, I am actually a lawyer, but I'm one of those lawyers that never practiced. I was kind of in love with the idea of being a lawyer, and I'm probably going to age myself with the example here. But when I was, finishing high school and going into university, there was this TV show called Ally McBeal. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of it or was born then. And Ally McBeal was just such a phenomenal legal show. It was like full of energy and people would break into song. And I think my romantic 17-year-old self imagined that that was what it was going to be like practicing law in the real world. I studied law, came back to Kenya, and then I did my pupillage. And my pupillage I did at a wonderful firm then called Hamilton, Harrison and Matthews. And 2 weeks in, I was like, this is nothing like Ally McBeal. There was no one jumping and breaking into song, and I was busy doing case reconstructions from 1952. And that just really showed me that that was not the life that I was going to go into. Somewhere and somewhat serendipitously, or if that's the right way to say it, I bumped into an old friend, and he was in town setting up the Microsoft office. And this was the second office they were setting up in sub-Saharan Africa after the South Africa office. And he was looking for somebody to kind of anchor it, get it set up, and over a drink offered me the job, to which I said absolutely yes, even though, to be honest, I had never heard of Microsoft. I have to confess and say I'd never touched a computer in my life until that point in time. And I didn't even know who Bill Gates was until later that night over dinner when I mentioned it to my dad and my younger brother. And my younger brother was like, "You're going to work for the richest man in the world." And I'm like, "Really?" So my tumbling into the technology field was completely unplanned, and I have no regrets whatsoever. I proceeded to work at Microsoft for quite a long time. I actually worked there for exactly 20 years to the day. And in there, or while I was there, I had the pleasure of taking on multiple or wearing multiple hats in the organization. I spent quite a bit of time in finance and administration. I moved on into marketing, and I did all sorts of marketing, product marketing, channel development, and then general marketing. Maybe about 13 years in, I segued a little bit from my marketing journey and took on a role in HR, and really was somewhat on a whim because at the time we'd been looking for an HR director for the region for the longest time, and it just didn't seem to be working out. And they asked me to take on the role, and I thought to myself, I don't know, anything, the first thing about HR. But also, I've come to learn myself, and I know that for the most part, the things that I enjoy about life is I like, and it's probably a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I like new things. I like building things. I like kind of being like the first, kind of group of people there in a survivor type environment and trying to make things work. So I took the job in HR, and strangely enough, discovered so many areas of synergy between marketing and HR. If you think about it, if you think about from an HR point of view, you've got to win the hearts and minds of your employees. And from a marketing point of view, you win the hearts and minds of your customers and your partners. And so when you think about it, the core competency there is around winning hearts and minds, and it doesn't really matter who the audience is, right? You prepare employee value propositions very much like you create customer value propositions. So for me, it was extremely transferable, the skill set between HR and marketing. Until today, I actually encourage HR people, if you want to get a good sense of the work that the organization does or build up your business acumen, take a role in marketing. It's almost like a seamless move over. I spent 5 years in HR, and it was a wonderful 5 years, and probably the worst 5 years of my professional life. Unlike marketing, where you get a lot of wonderful accolades, the HR role is a thankless job, and I speak on behalf of every HR person around the world. You can kind of see the impact of the work you're doing. You see the people in the organization, they're growing, but nobody ever realizes that this is as a result of some heavy lifting that you put in as an HR person. But on the flip side, I have to say, coming from a legal and marketing background, one thing that HR taught me how to do was to really kind of take a pause. Don't always be quick with the answer, because oftentimes in marketing, in legal and so on, or very strong customer facing functions, you're expected to kind of have the right response for a customer, or the right answer, or the solution, or whatever it may be. And I found that HR really allowed me to hone my skill, particularly around coaching, because what it forced me to do is not be in a hurry to solve for the problem, but really to take a step back and be able to lead the person that you're working with in a discovery-led process towards the solutions, or at least the options they should consider. But, it was wonderful. I ended up shifting back into marketing, and I joined a wonderful organization within Microsoft called Microsoft for Africa. Some of you may have heard of it. We were a team of 12 people with a really good budget and charged with catalyzing the innovation ecosystem across Africa and essentially building the next addressable market for Microsoft on the continent. It was a phenomenal job, a phenomenal role in a phenomenal team. It was kind of like, it was maybe my first experience somewhat, like being, almost like being in a startup, because we were a small team, very lean, and with a mandate that wasn't necessarily kind of like the heavy commercially driven mandate that Microsoft would typically drive. And almost it felt like being at a startup, but with an angel investor that had very deep pockets. So we had like $75 million, we had 5 years, and it was kind of like, figure out what you want to do with this and how you're going to really kind of turn Africa on for the organization. I spent 5 years there as the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer. And then it was 20 years, and I'd given, like, literally, and you can see my gray hair, my entire youth to this organization. And I felt at that point, the role itself allowed me to really explore what was happening, not necessarily with an internal lens, but, and then more specifically around the startup ecosystem across Africa. And I was super intrigued. I was intrigued from two perspectives. I was intrigued by, kind of young people, fresh ideas, solving local problems, local solutions, local developers, local skills. And it just felt like it had come at me from, sometimes being in a big corporate, you're in this isolated universe and you don't really realize what's happening around you, except you've got to sell the next Windows product or the next Microsoft Office or whatever the case may be. So seeing that and being a part of that ecosystem for me just kind of triggered something in me. And then the second level of intrigue for me was to start to question myself, and I still believe this to this day, is that our strongest talent in Africa, or a huge chunk of our strongest talent on this continent, is sitting in wonderful corporate jobs at multinationals. And I started to ask myself, it's like, so who's going to build the Microsofts in Africa if not us, right? And so with that in mind and kind of feeling a bit like, my time has come and gone, and there are younger people who've come into the organization, and really kind of having spent so much time in the startup ecosystem in the preceding 5 years, I just felt I wanted to be a part of this, wonderful universe. So I gave my notice 18 months early and said to them, on the 6th of December 2016, I'm going to be leaving the organization. That was going to be the day it was going to turn to 20 years. And on the 6th of November 2016, I actually realized, and I think this is a huge problem for a lot of people in corporate, that I was leaving the organization, but I had no plan. I didn't have a great idea that I was going to just go and kick off my startup and just be part of this amazing energy. I didn't know where to start. And so in this period of kind of faffing about and not being entirely sure, and maybe kind of, doing advisory work in one or two startups and trying to figure out how and where do I want to play, GE, General Electric, came calling. And I ended up taking the job of CMO Africa for the healthcare division of GE. And it was the biggest mistake of my life, for starters, and not because the organization is not a great organization. I think we all know GE and particularly historically the role that they've played, and they come from probably one of the earliest entrepreneurs, Thomas Edison. I mean, just what a phenomenal story. But I kind of got there, and it was the opposite of what I imagined. It was I was back to kind of business reviews and getting my butt kicked. I was not working with any startups, the things that had really turned me on when I was leaving the organization. And I promise you, 6 weeks in, I was like, this is just not going to work. So I decided to give it a year, and exactly a year later to the day, I ended up leaving GE. And at that time, I was a little bit smarter, I would think. And an ex-colleague of mine from Microsoft, Ivan Lumala, and myself joined hands and then kicked off Tellistic. So enough of the history, just to tell you a little bit about what Tellistic does. And remember, I'm a marketer and a lawyer, so I tend to talk a lot. So please bear with me with the storytelling. So Tellistic, almost, kind of Ivan and I really felt at that point in time that we knew what we wanted to do. It was definitely going to be in tech. It was definitely going to be about the ability to empower not just ourselves, but a lot of tech ecosystems, particularly within the African continent. And we knew we wanted to do something with startups. It took us about a year before we finally honed in on what our areas of specialization were going to be. So today, Tellistic is and I wonder if someone's trying to interrupt me. Emma, you trying to say something? Or maybe not. I thought I heard some feedback on the line. So today, Holistic is a data and AI software development company. We build a lot of solutions for primarily the enterprise ecosystem, and that's the first half of our practice. But the second half of our practice is really focused around capacity building, both within the startup ecosystem. So for example, the BimaLab Accelerator, but also for a lot of young people in corporate jobs, a lot of organizations that we service. I think that the skills play is pretty obvious to everybody. And so we do quite a bit of work in terms of capacity building as well. So that's kind of me and the journey that I've been on. When we were thinking about, the different areas of conversation that we wanted to have in the context of this BimaLab Accelerator, for me, and I know I said, it was the best and worst job of my life, and for some reason I can't seem to run away from people development or HR type conversations. I think, it's a passion of mine, and it's an area that I think Emma mentioned it earlier when she said that oftentimes, especially, and I'm a startup myself, we get so caught up in doing the stuff that we need to do for customers, for product. How are we going to go to market? What does our billing look like? How do we onboard our customers? And that entire conversation. And we really have a reactive approach to the people discussion or our organizational capacity discussion internally. And it tends to almost be triggered by, we need to hire a new person. Okay, what are we going to do? Oh, we're short on this. Or we have this new customer coming on board. We don't have enough people to service that. And so it's really reactionary in nature. And I feel that really the purpose of this conversation today is to spur some discussion around how and when should you be thinking about what. I know that there's a number of people on the call who are in completely different levels in terms of maturity, whether you're from the startup ecosystem or whether you're just an individual that's really interested in the topic. And sometimes it's difficult to create a narrative or conversation that serves everybody. So if it's relevant to you, or some pieces are relevant to you and some you've kind of already been down that journey, I completely appreciate that. And if you would like to add your comments and feedback to the conversation, those would be really welcome. There's no hard and fast rules. There's no wrong or right way. I think the way I've kind of structured this is to really have a discussion around, from my experience, what do I feel is important? How should you go about doing 1, 2, 3, 4? And then I'll lean a lot on some of my previous experience, both at Microsoft and then partly at GE, and then also as a startup founder myself. So such a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm just going to dive right into it. So obviously there was the welcome introductions, and that's what I ended up talking to without moving the slides. But we're going to touch on, in my view, 4 key areas. The first piece is just around levers for growth and the positioning from my perspective around where do people, or the people discussion or the labor discussion, where does that fit in? Then we'll delve a little bit deeper into hiring for growth. And as you grow your organization or go up that ladder of maturity, what should you be thinking about when? We'll touch a little bit on compensation. And I have to say that on the compensation piece, I really had to think 2 or 3 times around it to say, I don't know that there are any right or wrong answers on compensation itself. But I do know that every time I get into a conversation with a startup, more often than not, if we touch on people, then there's always the conversation about compensation, because compensation is almost a function then of retention, attraction and retention, and so on. So I thought, I'd share some data that I came across, and maybe some of you have come across that, but we'll touch a little bit on compensation. And then we'll touch on one of my favorite topics, which is your organizational structure and how you should think of that. And then we'll wrap up with questions, feedback, and comments. We've got, it's a 2-hour session, and I've been yakking away for about 20 minutes with just the intro. But I think that we should make good time, and I believe that we'll have more than enough time for our question, feedback, and comments. But if you do have a burning issue, unfortunately, I'm sharing my screen, and I may not be able to see your hand up, but maybe Emma or Marianne or one of the 2 of them will ping me and just ask me to slow down if somebody has a burning question or comment to contribute. So let's talk a little about key levers. So I've got this slide, and I'm a heavy reader. I'm one of those, I read something like, I can't tell you how many books a month I read or blogs or whatever the case may be. I'll be the first to confess that oftentimes my reading is not always intellectual, but I do tend to consume quite a number of blogs. And over the recent, I would say maybe the last year and a half, there's one guy that has really been speaking to me and really hitting the right notes in terms of levers or leverage and how to, what should you leverage in terms of growing your organization. And I'm sorry to say that this is not necessarily original. It's kind of my interpretation. So some of you may have come across this context before. So, we all went to school. We all know, I believe, or have seen some version of this slide, which is around give me a place to stand, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the earth. And that really, for me, captures the spirit of what leverage is. We're all, or for the most part, most people on this call are all in the business of building a business. And in the spirit of building a business, it's always important to kind of step back and imagine, you kind of want to figure out where do you want to invest and what are your trade-offs if you put your time, your energy, or your funds in a certain area. How does that pay off in terms of driving up the growth that you're trying to look for in your organization? And really, that's what leverage is about. And so the individual that has been inspiring me on this conversation, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with Naval Ravikant. He harps on about leverage like you can't believe. But of course, like I said, I'm putting my own spin on it. And so when I look then at the power of leverage, and particularly from a startup point of view, I think that there are three core areas that we certainly want to consider. The first potential point of leverage is always going to be your people. Oftentimes, I come across people, I've worked at places where everyone says, people are your most important asset, people are your greatest asset. And unfortunately, half the time, the activities of the organization either don't map that message, or we're not doing enough around thinking about then how do you optimize people as a real lever. I think when we look at it historically, it is the original form of leverage. People have always worked somewhere or for something, right? So in this case, we're talking about labor, whether it was in the second or third industrial revolution, or whether we're talking about now in the tech context. It's definitely the oldest form of leverage. But there's always questions around people as a form of leverage. And I'm sure all of you have gone through this conversation with yourself. Big questions about, does people scale? Does labor scale? Even with ourselves and in our own organization, we got to the point where we had to kind of stop and take a step back and ask ourselves, if we really want to continue growing as an organization, does it equal for every new account that we sign up or that we have on board or new customer that we engage, to be able to service them exponentially, it means that you need to grow your people line exponentially. And I know that you will agree with me when I say that that's where the question marks come up in terms of how scalable is it for you to rely on people as your primary lever. Now, we know on the flip side that you can't do without people. And so a lot of our conversation today is going to be about not saying that, don't use people as a form of leverage, or not saying that people is your only form of leverage. And so exponentially grow this as your company exponentially grows their revenue. But I think the big question here is around, how do you optimize on your people strategy to get the most out of it? The second reason why the people conversation is super important is because it requires, for people to be a real form of leverage for you, they have to want to follow you, right? And for people en masse to want to follow you, and particularly for startup founders, then it requires a huge amount of leadership skills. And today's conversation is not necessarily on leadership skills, but I just wanted to drop that point so that you remember that people don't follow nobody, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you want your people, if you want to optimize people within your organization as a lever for growth, it starts with the leader within that organization. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's talk about the second form of leverage, which in my view, and we're talking about startups here, it's capital, right? So, and listen, this is a phenomenal form of leverage. And it's capital in all its forms. I'm fond of saying, and people know I say this all the time, the best source of capital is a paying customer. But of course, when you're at the stage where you really want to move on, you're kind of at the great customer traction stage, and now you really want to grow your organization exponentially, it also means that you're at the stage where you're starting to look for capital external to the organization, right? So you're going to raise capital for somebody else. And honestly, capital is a great form of leverage, right? But it also means that it requires you to almost trade off against something, right? So you will raise capital, you'll give something in return. It scales very well, particularly if you're very good at managing capital. And if you look at the turn of the 20th century, the organizations that really scaled and grew was the financial services sector. And the reason for that is they were flush with capital. Now we see that happening now in the startup ecosystem. There's a lot of VC money floating around. It's a great form of leverage. But of course, and I think over the next few weeks, as we continue with the accelerator, we've got some good conversations coming up around capital and how and where and so on. So I encourage you to attend those. Today, our focus is going to be on number one, but this is just to kind of set the scene. Then the third, and I debated on what to call this. I didn't know whether to call it technology or call it code or whatever it may be. But the third form of leverage is really technology or code, or the ability to automate systems and processes within your organization. It is a beautiful form of leverage. And I'm going to give you an example of what we mean by this. So, for example, today you're servicing maybe 5,000 customers. To service 5,000 customers, apart from your building team, so your tech team on the back end, you've got a bunch of sales and business development individuals that go out there and acquire the customer. Then the customer comes on board and you've got an onboarding team that figures out how to onboard this customer and get them using your technology as quickly as possible. And then you've got that retention phase with your customer, because we all know that it's harder to retain an existing, it's harder to gain a new customer than it is to retain an existing customer. And you want to make sure that you have and continue to have the opportunity to upsell and cross-sell into your existing customer. All of those are probably, depending on your stage of development, served by the first form of leverage, which is people. The question is, when you look at your organization, how much of that can be solved through repeatable processes that are created by code? For example, if we look at your business development or your sales team, right? Could you end up having some 3, rather than having 20 sellers, could you kind of optimize on your people, have the right 3 people, but really back that up with a wonderful freemium model that allows customers to go in, sign up on their own, and even onboard themselves onto the product? What does that look like? And we're talking about leverage, remember. So it really depends on what you want to trade off to invest in for your benefit, depending on where you see the best outcome coming from. So the whole concept of code is to create repeatable processes powered by technology that then allow you to focus on building the right product and being able to solve the problem you're trying to solve for your customer and reduce your dependency on capital and on people. That's the whole theory behind it. Now, I'm going to caveat again and say this conversation is about people. So I'm by no means trying to say, don't do people or don't do capital. I'm just saying that you certainly want to have a strong element of code in there that helps you then optimize the first two. But I'm always inspired in my mind, and I'm sure a number of you are. I look, and I was saying this to my team not so long ago because I was sharing this same slide with them. It always intrigues me when a company like Instagram, I may have the numbers, but how Facebook had like 30, they were acquired by Facebook by how many of us? I mean, like, and we're all business people on this call. You've got to look at that model and really question, like, how do you get to that level of such optimization, right? That you're getting customers coming on board. You're not exponentially growing your people cost, because this comes down to cost. You've got such built-in optimization in terms of the people component versus the code component, and then the capital that surrounds that, that you end up selling to Facebook for some billions of dollars with 13 people in your organization and servicing 30 million users. The question is then, how do we get there? And I think that that's some of the conversation that we're going to have today. So I'm going to move on a little bit then and talk about hiring for growth, right? And this is my interpretation. Like I said, it really depends on your organization and what your specific needs are. And this is somewhat generalized, but I went through this exercise of trying to imagine, when would you hire for what, right? In your journey as a startup. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit here. Now, there are people who will agree or disagree with the stages as I have kind of lined them up there. This is my interpretation of it. I mean, you can play around with it. And because we're talking about people, I decided not to focus on growth stage based on revenue. Because then, obviously we would say that Instagram is only in the traction or was only in the traction stage when they were acquired. But because we're talking about people, I decided to overlay a people lens on it, because I think this is almost the journey of a typical startup anyway. So I would imagine that at the founding stage, you're probably at 0 to 5 employees. It's probably a bunch of co-founders, maybe 1 or 2 additional people outside the organization, outside of the founder team. And then you kind of go into early stage, about 5 to 10 employees. It's kind of growing. You've probably added a couple more resources into the organization, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to just kind of frame this all the way up to scale, because then I want to map this out vis-a-vis the people conversation and where your investments, in my view, should be going, and obviously open for debate. So at the founding stage, like I said, this is potentially group of founders, maybe 1 or 2 extra people outside of the founders, right? At this point in time, you're not looking necessarily for super specialists who are like pure supremists in terms of a specific type of technology or a specific skill set in terms of go-to-market and so on. At this stage, what you really want is a group of adaptable doers, as they're often called, right? Or generalists. It's people who kind of are at this stage, you're kind of testing your product market fit. You want people who can do a lot of the same, of different things, and are not necessarily experts at any one thing at all. And the focus at this stage is really kind of getting a great product out, getting a great MVP out, and really trying to test it with customers to understand if you have product market fit. So at this stage, my advice would be, and I know most people are past this stage, but we're building up the pyramid as we talk. You're looking for adaptable people. You want them to be doers, can roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty. You're not looking at specialists here. As founders yourselves, you're also rolling up your sleeves and you're hyper involved. You're the people who are going to sign up the first customer. You're going to test against your customers. You're going to do customer discovery. This is the stage where this happens. The next level is typically referred to as the early stage, right? And in the early stage, now you're kind of growing your team a little bit beyond the founding stage. So you probably add 1, 2, 3 more people. The advice here is to stick to generalists and more specifically multitaskers. So people who can hold 3 or 4 balls in the air at the same time and still punch at the right level to give you the right returns on what you need to happen at this early stage. This is also the stage where you launch your product into the market and you really start acquiring the first, hopefully, paid users of your product. And paid is generic in the sense that it can be from a customer is paying for the product directly, or maybe your monetization strategy is somewhat different to that. But at this point, you want to start seeing that there's a monetizable component to your product. And at this point, you also start to validate your product market fit. So you kind of tested it in the early stage. Here is where you really hone it and sculpt it and ensure that you've got the right messaging and the right value proposition for your customers. At this point, I spent years in marketing, so I may be biased. I think it's never too early to start thinking of your brand, and I'll explain what I mean. I have a friend and we frequently banter because we frequently both sit as advisors with different startups. Half the time, a startup will tell us we're building a platform for X. Half the time, it'll turn out that really they were building, it's a widget, right? Who are you? And how do you define yourself, your brand, your product? This starts to influence a number of things. It will start to influence, for example, how you're going to go to market. So to use the example of a widget versus a platform, for me, platforms are often multifaceted, have the potential of bringing in hundreds and millions of users and so on. Widgets kind of have that same ability, but the truth is they're highly embeddable as well, right? So some of those questions will then start to influence your product distribution strategy, obviously. So it's important early on to even imagine or understand from your customer, how do they view you and what do you think of your brand? The other day, I thought I was talking to a customer and I thought I was selling the most important thing in this customer's universe. And at the end of a 1 hour conversation, the truth is, and sadly for me, I had to acknowledge the fact that I was a nice to have, right? I wasn't core to their reason for being. So this for me is so important at this early stage, because then it starts to tell you how you're going to go to market, via whom, how you're going to deliver this product. Is it going to be an API? Is it going to be an SDK? Is it going to be a web-based platform or whatever you want to call it, right? So that for me is where that conversation starts to happen. The next, oh, hold on, sorry, my bad. The next level is what we call the traction stage, and traction obviously is determined by paying customers and starting to build revenue. So you're starting to gain traction in terms of consumption of your platform. And for me, in the early stage and founding stage, you are the chief seller as the founder or your co-founder, or maybe your early 1 or 2 employees who are generalists, right? This is the time for you to start imagining that you want to invest in business development and in sales, right? Business development for me is slightly different from sales. Oftentimes they're used interchangeably, but for me, business development tends to be a more breadth approach in terms of where is the opportunity, how do we land this opportunity with the customer, how do we build the right pipeline for our organization. Sales is the actual act of closing, right? So, but this is the time to kind of look at those two, figure out what you want to lean in favor of, and you want to start investing in business development and sales. It's also the time, in my view, to really figure out your pricing. I'm sure a number of you have been through this journey before. I know I have. This was one of the hardest things for me as a startup founder that I had to do. I still don't know if I have the magic right, because sometimes, and you know it too, it sounds like, are we too cheap? Are we too expensive? Is the customer getting value for this? Should we go with cost plus, or do we go with value-based pricing? For me, this is really the space where you want to figure that out and ensure that you're hitting the right notes with the way you're landing your product, what your pricing looks like, because that ties back to monetization. And at the traction stage, this is where you're starting to gain almost a critical mass of customers, right? And it ties to the next point around ensuring that you're consistently getting your product in front of customers. That's what biz dev does. Make sure that your product is consistently getting in front of customers. But from a people stage, in my view, this is really the time that you want to look at investing in, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in a good board of advisors or an advisory board. I mentioned earlier, I think I sit currently on 3 or 4 advisory boards. These are non-paid for positions, but I know the value that advisors or advisory boards bring to a startup, particularly when we start talking about hiring and what skill set do you want to lean in favor of, and so on. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But for me, at traction stage, you want to start thinking about whose brain do I want to have on tap to consistently pick, because now you're starting to go deeper with your product, biz dev, sales, pricing, some of those things. You want to start thinking of the financing. How do you start to do that?
I'll record on my phone. I just want your room.
Okay. JP, do you mind muting your line?
Or do you take a video of me now? So I really
Okay. The video. Emma or Marianne, can you mute JP?
want to get me properly, lighting, all that stuff.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so the next stage is the growth stage, right? Growth, you're probably trending about 20 to 50 employees, right? This is a wonderful space. This, is Typically, depending on when you want to raise funds, some people can do early stage fundraising. More often than not, you're definitely going to raise funds anyway at growth stage, because this is what gets the ball rolling and ensures that the organization is able to go through that hyper growth phase. For me, this is the space where you want to invest really well in a strong finance team or head of finance or whatever you want to call them. At this point, managing money is important. You want to make sure that you've got enough runway. You want to make sure that your burn rate actually makes sense, because here you're really growing. You're growing the team. You're growing how you service customers, customer onboarding, and so on. But at the same time, this is the space where you want to start investing in specialists. You may at traction stage have had 1 or 2 specialists on board, but really at the growth stage is where you start to go deep on specialized skill. This is also the space at this point, you've already proven your product market fit, you've got traction, you've got paying customers. So you want to start playing around with, for example, potential additional product lines for your base product, or additional or new use cases for your product, right? And that requires, to a large extent, a good set of deep specialized skills, because for me, in this space is where this is the growing up phase of a startup, right? So you really want great depth in terms of the skill set that's available to you at that point in time. But key for me here is certainly kitting out or ensuring that you've got a strong finance function in place, because you're going to die if you don't do this at this phase. The last piece is at scale, then what happens? And I think at this point, it's anybody's game. You probably have a lot of paying customers. You've got some funding that you've raised that is really about scaling your business. You want to make sure number one conversation to have is that you've got a strong people and operations team, right? This is the point where you can't afford to take 3 months or 6 months to hire a new guy who is vital to the growth of your organization. So you really want to ensure that that whole pipeline of talent, from talent attraction, acquisition, retention, talent development, and so on, is a well thought out process, because at 50 employees plus, honestly, if that's not happening, you're going to end up having the opposite of what happens when you have a good culture, which is that as fast as people are coming in, that's how fast those people are leaving your organization. I've seen it happen across the board with different startups where they hyperscaled, they raised some good funding, they employed a bunch of people. In fact, they got to the point where they couldn't keep pace with the open positions. So in fact, you now start just employing almost like people to plug in and fill the holes, but you're not even paying attention to the kind of talent or the kind of individuals or the kind of culture you're building in your organization. So for me, this is the time to really think about it strategically. I talked about operations here, so structure and process, even handoff, for example, between engineering, biz dev, the marketing team, the sales organization, the customer success team. All of that at this point in time is heavily linked in the operations space. So you really want to ensure that you've got some optimized processes to ensure that things don't break within your organization. The third one I would touch on here is likely at this stage. Remember, at traction stage, you had a board of advisors. They're fantastic guys. They're rooting for you. They probably have a great network. But this stage at scale is really where you want to think of having a strong board of directors, and primarily for purposes of governance and sustainability of the organization. I often say to startup founders that the future, your future and the future of your company are not necessarily, it's so sad to say this, but they're not necessarily the same future. In fact, at times, and almost we've seen examples of this at Uber and so on, where at some point, even it's important for the company to step away from the founder, right? And the reason why you want governance and sustainability built in at this point in time is because you want to ensure that your personal future is not interfering with the direction and future of the company, because you owe it to the organization and the investors and the employees and the customers that you have in place. So this is a good time to start thinking of a board of directors. And then finally, and I don't know whether that fits there or doesn't fit there, but I just thought to myself, you know, Tonya, we're in the data business. We really, and it's one of my favorite phrases around harping on about a data-driven organization. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're in. At the scale point, you want to remember the leveraging code piece. This is where you really want to ensure, because you've got a good critical mass of customers, how do you leverage data within your organization to be a key lever in terms of driving your growth? So you want to think about that in that phase. So this is the universe according to me. Of course, it's not written in stone. Things can shift and move depending on what your individual priorities are. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to kind of set the tone around when and how should you be thinking about what type of investments in terms of people. So that kind of takes us then to the second most important topic. We are all startup, or most of us on this call are startup founders or work at a startup. And I think I speak for everybody when I say that it's a constant struggle to recruit top talent without breaking the bank, to ensure that they stay, to compete with the market and market salaries and super established companies. And at the same time, you still need this exceptional talent. And so you're constantly in this cycle. I know every time there's no startup founder who won't tell you about the greatest people they hired. They came, you invested in them, and then they left you. And it's wonderful to see Richard Branson posting and saying, trained them so well that, you know, everyone wants them and trained them so well that they won't want to leave or whatever. But we all know the reality. The reality is really around, sorry about that. The reality is really around, you're going to have to really have some sort of balance between where do I get the talent? Do I buy the talent? Do I build the talent? Or do I borrow the talent? And I wanted to touch on this a little bit. So let's talk about buying talent. And buying talent is typically what we all do. We recruit talent from the external labor market. So we're growing, our business is growing exponentially. We therefore need 5 new engineers or whatever the case may be. We go out to the market, we interview people, and hopefully we hire them. The problem with buying, there's nothing wrong. By the way, none of these strategies are wrong. Everything has its pros and cons. Problem with buying is that oftentimes, particularly if you're heavy on the tech front, you will know that great technology resources, great software engineers, great data engineers, great data scientists are scarce resources, and they are highly competitive. So you'll hire them, and then my darlings, my former employers, Microsoft, will announce that they're now creating a new Africa Development Center, and they're hiring 300 software engineers in Kenya. And then, you know, people will go work for Microsoft, who can pay better than you, who also have a bigger brand than you do, right? So buying has its issues around that. I think also, secondly, and I mentioned it earlier, particularly as you get into growth and scale, you find that you can't keep up with the type of hiring that you need to do. You're literally onboarding people every month, new people every week, and so on. And sometimes there you start to compromise the quality or the type of talent that's right for you, just to fill the gaps at that point in time. And therefore, culture, quality, and so on run away a little bit from you. But on the flip side, it's also your fastest way to get to market, right? So the other two, build and borrow, are okay. But if you really want to move fast, you're probably better off going out there and driving a huge recruitment drive and getting the skills that you need. So that's your option one, buy the talent. Option two is building talent. And, you know, as a former HR, person, and maybe to a certain extent still, I think nobody will be surprised when I say that I love this piece around developing existing talent within your business and allowing them then to take on new roles. And I think that works really well, right? Number one, this is the gift that keeps on giving. It starts to create a culture or a sense of we're going places as an organization and I can grow within this organization. And it allows you at that moment to re-recruit your team because they see and believe that they can grow with you. So it's such a wonderful gift if you go down the direction of building, right? The truth is, it's also quite time consuming, as you know. You're not going to have a person come in today and then they're ready for the next role in 2 weeks or in 2 months. I mean, you really need to have a real intentional approach to how you're going to build skills and how you're going to build the talent bench within your organization to then allow you to fill in the new roles as they come up or as you go up that pyramid around maturity for your organization. But like I said, super rewarding in terms of building loyalty, in terms of building culture, a tradition, a sense of belonging within the organization. Your third option is to borrow the talent. And this is really around temporary resources, right? You can get a bunch of consultants because you're looking at scaling your growth right now, or you want to build a sales organization and you decide, I'm not yet at the point where I want to hire or create a role for a chief sales officer, but I want somebody who's going to coach these 5 salespeople. So why don't I get a consultant in on a short-term basis to do that, right? Oftentimes, the skills that you want to borrow, I mean, in some cases, people want to outsource some mundane functions. For me, borrowing skills always leans towards the skills that really you can't afford. And so it's almost like a short-term gap. But I also want to call out, and I talked about, the advisor piece there. I think it's an excellent strategy in terms of being able to borrow the skills that you need to scale your organization. I promise you, even after my 20 years in corporate, and for those who worked in corporate, if a startup approaches you and asks you to sit on their board of advisors, you even feel it even looks good for you within the organization. So for startup founders out there who are really struggling with some of these skills and are not sure where to get them, I really think the advisory board route is a wonderful space for you to be able to borrow talent, right? But having said that, I think ultimately the tactic, I mean, all those things, and I talked about Richard Branson and all of that, ultimately, this is what we all do. You buy who you need and you borrow who you can't afford, and you hope that the rest of it really works out, which sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. But we'll come back and touch on a couple of those points in a few minutes. So I wanted, and I felt it was going to be remiss of me to do all of that or speak through all of that and not talk about the culture piece and traditions, right? The things that make your organization, or distinctly you, or the flavor that you personally, or the personality that you give to your organization. And this really, for me, wraps around skills, motivations, and values, and particularly with regards to who you hire and who you promote within your organization. So a couple of tips, and I just threw these points on here because I wanted to make sure that we touch on it. And the reason I wanted to is because it's the second most asked question from me, or to me, by startup founders around how do we build a great culture? And the truth is I don't necessarily know the answers. What I can tell you is a couple of things. Number one, identify your values. And this is the one space where, as a startup founder, you can be opinionated. You're allowed to be opinionated. You want to say things that are very authentic to you and make sure that that's part of your culture. And everybody will go through different processes that allows them to get to the point where you're able to figure out what's authentic to you. But I would strongly encourage that this is the space where you don't want to hide what you feel, or you don't want to be shy about what you feel your values are as an organization. I think the second thing, and oftentimes with a lot of founders, even in hiring conversations, that I find is that we're trying to be everything to everybody. Meaning you're going to have a couple of conversations with people, depending, say, oh, I would love to work at a place that allows me freedom to come up with new ideas and execute on them. Say, oh, we're very free here. You can come and also do that here. I don't think you can be everything to everybody. And it speaks to the first piece around what are your values and how do you stay true to them, even when you feel that you found the perfect person for the role, but there's a bit of a misalignment on the values. How do you kind of like recheck yourself and ensure that you're staying true to your value system, because you know what kind of organization you're putting together. You kind of know what fits. I always say that there are things that people can learn and things that they can't learn. And honestly, values are some of the things that it is extremely difficult for people to learn. Skills are easily learned. Values, not necessarily. So don't try to be everything to everybody, even the people who are already on your team. I think the third point is once in a while I'll pop into an interview for a startup, interviewing for a potential role. And it feels almost like during hiring, people will spend time trying to convince people about why you're the best place for them, or why they're the best person for you, how aligned you are in terms of values, how this, that, connected to trying to be everything to everybody. I really believe that people are either aligned or they're not aligned, and particularly on the value piece and the motivations piece. More often than not, people will interview with a view or a lens that is weighted heavily in terms of the skills. I would really suggest that you weight it just as heavily in terms of what motivates that individual. Why do they get up every day and go to work? And what value system do they subscribe to in the workplace? So I just wanted to touch on this piece and say, as you're doing all this build, borrow, buy, as you're looking at how you're going to grow your organization from early stage all the way through to scale, this piece around your culture and the traditions that you build in your organization, that you encourage in your organization, that speak to the kind of people that you hire, and more importantly for your existing staff, that speak to the kind of people that get promoted or are making it or are deemed to be successful in your organization, for me is around these three pieces. So I just wanted to share that quickly. So to summarize that piece, there's a couple of lessons I learned early on, and I learned them both in my corporate life and I learned them, within my startup journey. And, if anyone else has some lessons they'd like to share, they're wholly welcome. I strongly subscribe to the context around hiring senior leaders earlier than you think you need them. Typically, at the early stage, kind of getting into growth and traction stage, you will find that people have a wonderful young team that is full of enthusiasm, but honestly, they lack senior leadership. And that is to your detriment as a founder. In fact, I strongly believe in almost creating an apprentice concept within your organization that allows this young and wonderful, enthusiastic team to learn from an individual, your senior leader, who's kind of walked that path before. The second reason why this is important is because for you as a founder, it allows you to free up your time, right? Because you find that if everybody else within your organization is kind of early to just getting to mid-level career stage, they come to you for answers or decisioning. You're kind of the chief of everything in your organization. It doesn't allow you to do the things that you're supposed to be doing well, right? Which is directing the strategy, the thinking within your organization. If possible, as much as possible, and I know senior leaders don't come cheap, but trust me, you will hire one CTO and he'll be equivalent to 3 mid or early stage developers, and he'll get you faster to where you need to get to. So if you can, and you can work your numbers around this, I strongly recommend that you hire your senior leaders earlier. One last note on this one. In my view, and every time I engage with VCs and so on, they love it. Sometimes it helps speak to the vision and ambition that you have for the company because you've actually invested in the right level of resources and they can see the direction that the company is going to head in. So that's my first lesson learned. My second lesson learned, and I talked about this earlier, is really around that conundrum between do I go for generalist or do I go for specialist? And it's not necessarily about it's either generalists or specialists until I'm at a certain stage and then I'll move on. I think the more important point here is about getting the mix right and the timing right based on what's required to be able to help you achieve that kind of organizational or business success that you're looking for. So I want to kind of ensure that on this piece, it's not to say that never go for generalists or don't go for specialists until a certain stage. It's about really thinking strategically and intentionally about how do you get the right mix and the right timing in terms of when do you lean towards specialists and when do you lean towards we need a generalist for this type of function. So you want to play those out against each other. I talked about advisory boards before and I said we'd come back and visit it. I am such a huge fan of the concept of advisory boards and I hope you are too. Like I said to you, it is a wonderful opportunity for you to borrow skills. If you're at the point where you're looking at fundraising, so I'm ruthlessly selfish about advisory boards, right? If we're looking, for example, at fundraising, and I know I've got a great accountant, but he's not the one that's going to put together 1, 2, 3, 4 term sheets, I don't know, documents or whatever it is for me. My recommendation is switch out your advisory board a little bit and ensure that you load it with people who are great at the fundraising concept. If, for example, you're headed into the traction phase of your business and it's really about customer acquisition, look to acquire almost like a CMO equivalent, a chief marketing officer, but it's somebody who sits on your advisory board. And remember, these are not paid positions and people don't expect them to be paid positions. I mentioned earlier, I think there are thousands of people sitting in corporate that would love to sit as an advisor. It looks great on their CV. It makes them look wonderful. And ultimately, I think internally in everybody's heart is that need to give back in some sort of way. They would love to do that for you. And you in turn get the opportunity to leverage their network, to leverage their expertise, to get a wonderful diversity of opinions without you having to be the one carrying all the heavy thinking in your head. And honestly, to get the skill set that you require. One caveat on this that I don't always see working, that sometimes people do, is they put on a big name on their advisory board in the hopes of attracting investments. Honestly, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. That's really up to you. But remember, it can be with your advisory board, they can serve for a year, they can serve for a shorter period of time. Just make sure that you're able to lean it towards the skill set that is lacking within your organization. And it is a wonderful way for you to be able to fill some of those gaps. I think the last piece is really around authenticity. I talked about it even before when we were talking about the values, motivations, and skills in your organization. I would really say, ultimately, I strongly advise that you be authentic in your hiring. You can't be everything to everybody. Don't make promises that you can't keep. And more importantly, it's really important that you stay true to your values as you bring more people on board, and particularly as the organization really starts to scale in size. Okay, so I'm going to quickly spend time on compensation, not too much time. I just wanted to touch on a couple of pointers here. It's a topic that always comes up. How much should I pay? How much should a junior salesperson earn? How much this, that? Do I give equity? Do I not give equity? And like I mentioned earlier, we're all struggling to recruit top talent and ensuring that we don't break the bank while we're doing it. Coincidentally, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, and I'll share the link to this, a startup, and I think it's OK High, if I say that name right, ran a wonderful survey not so long ago, kind of polling the startup ecosystem. And for me, having looked, and I have an HR background, and it's wonderful. For example, in Kenya, PwC do this wonderful salary survey every year. But when you look at it, it doesn't seem geared towards the startup ecosystem. So for me, one of the more comprehensive ones that I found, it may not be as detailed as what you get from PwC, but the OK High survey for me really just kind of gave the right view in terms of what's happening in the startup ecosystem. And I thought I'd share all up kind of from a high level, some of the outcomes of their surveys that allows you to benchmark, but I'll share the link as well and you can go take a look at it. But I will say, as a general rule of thumb, of course, the way we compensate people is based on three things. We have salary, we have benefits, we have stock, right? Good rule of thumb, though, is that the earlier the stage your company is in, the lower the salary, the lower the benefits, but potentially the higher the stock will be, right? Stock for me is a great topic. I think stock really makes sense, and it makes sense for that employee. So they've got to be able to look forward a little bit, but it really makes sense at the point in time that either the company is acquired or you go public. That's when stock means, in my view anyway, something major. Outside of that, I find myself, and I'd love to hear from other people around where is the value and how do you kind of rationalize salary and what they take home today versus the promise that is made within a stock conversation. And you really, I find that oftentimes in our markets where IPOs are not necessarily that many, right now it's better. We're seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions coming up. So there's an opportunity for stock to translate into something. But I find that oftentimes people will really critique that question around, you're giving me stock, what does it mean? Are you ever going to IPO? Are you ever going to be acquired? When does it translate into something? And you really want to figure out what you want to lean in favor of kind of playing up, and it makes the conversation, in my view, just a little bit more difficult. So the next few slides is kind of like, what were the highlights of the survey? I just wanted to throw that on there, but I want to make a comment on the first one. So 64% offer medical, 51% offer some benefit or other, 48% offer equity. And remember, I have a question around equity, and I don't know if everybody else does. Maybe it's just me being a bit, I forget, maybe a bit cynical, right? Then there's bonuses, 32%. I'm really surprised, especially for sales organizations. I promise you, I've worked with thousands of salespeople. Salespeople are motivated by bonuses, revenue-based incentives. So you want to think about that. And then stipends in lieu of salaries is very low. But it's funny, when I was going through the detail of the medical insurance, it seems, and these were startups that were polled, right? So something like 38 companies participated. This was a Kenya survey. 38 startup companies participated, and they're all the way from pre-seed all the way to later stage and kind of Series A, Series B type companies. And when they shared who they got the medical insurance from, there was no single name on the BimaLab accelerator that featured there. It was traditional insurance, right? So it was Britam, it was Jubilee, and so on. And I think that there's a huge, I know a number of you are doing some work in terms of pushing your insurance solutions into the startup ecosystem. I think that there's a huge market for that there, and I just wanted to kind of raise that as a bit of a pointer. But I thought I'd pull out some of the results of the survey. Like I said, I'll share the link with you. I'm not going to go too far, but I just wanted to share the kind of information that's out there and where and how do you pace yourself. In typical compensation conversations, we'll think about things like, where on the percentile do you want to be? So for example, if for a senior product manager, the maximum is about $8,000, this is a monthly in US dollars rate. The median seems to be about 5,000 and 2,200 is the base or the minimum that's getting paid out there. Where do you want to be on the median? And I'll give an example of this. For example, when I was at Microsoft, Microsoft was always clear, and they still are today. They have no ambition of being the best payer in the market. What they will do is they will pay at the 75th percentile, right? So all of these are great. Your point here is to establish benchmarks and say, if the median is 5,000 or 8,000 is the maximum, what's the 75th percentile? Typically then for a senior product manager, we'll pay about $6,000. And that's what our salary band is. You kind of want to think about some of those things, because what I'm finding a lot in the market is that it's up and down, and you can't, I'm sure you've gone through this challenge as well. You can't tell or budget or even create salary bands, because it really depends on who you hire, where they come from, what were they paid before, and that determines what you want to pay them. And I think that this doesn't serve us in the industry as a whole. So you really want to think about, what's your plan? Why do you want to be on what percentile? And how does that map into then your value proposition as an organization for your employees? It also means that you want to think about, so 1 year in, what do you increase this person to and why? And what's the basis of that? And for salespeople in particular, the norm, the rule of thumb, is that salespeople on a base pay will earn less than non-salespeople, because they have the potential to make the upside on bonuses. And remember, salespeople are motivated by bonus. If you pay your salespeople, let's say, for example, their base pay is equivalent to 80% of their total salary, and only 20% is bonus, that person is not going to sell for you. You need to make it a compelling percentage to ensure that they close the deals that they need to close for your business. So you want to think of that split between sales versus engineering or operations or marketing and so on. It also shows up here. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing, and we know this is a fact, engineering roles are paying higher than sales or operations roles. But for me, for salespeople, I strongly recommend that you certainly want to make sure that you lean in favor of a strong or highly leveraged plan that compensates them more on bonus, or significantly, almost like a 50-50 plan. They make 50% of their salary on base, 50% is on bonus based on closing X target. This is your quota, make your quota, make the money, and you're a happy person. So I wanted you to think about some of that. I'm not going to spend too much on this, because I want to touch lastly on organizational structure, and then we can go into Q&A, because I only have 45 minutes left. So structuring your organization is one of my favorite topics. It's the big question around how, right? So we've got wonderful on the, we've got like engineers and product people, and they're building great product. Then you've got salespeople who are out there selling, and it looks like it's okay. But the truth of the matter is that, in my view, there is no good or bad organizational structure, right? There's no right or wrong way to do this. The truth is, your organizational structure only matters in the context of what problem you're trying to solve for. And really, the truth is that ultimately, the way you structure your organization will have a massive impact on your ability to deliver on your goals as a company. So you want to spend some time really thinking about your org structure and how it shows up, right? So there's this, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with this, Conway's Law. which really seeks to bridge organizational structure, and particularly within the context of technology companies. And I quoted it there because it's, also makes me sound intelligent when I say Conway's Law. Organizations who design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. In other words, the structure of your software or whatever you're building or your product will mirror the structure of your organization. So you kind of want to think about it. And I want to spend a few minutes here, right? So I mentioned earlier, I spent a number of years at Microsoft. I've had, particularly within an HR context, the pleasure, honestly, of spending a bit of time with my counterparts, whether it was at Google or AWS and so on. And we would always compare notes. And I don't say this because I'm Microsoft, but I want to say that Microsoft has always been super effective at forming business units and understanding how to move people and resources to the most urgent need at that point in time. In fact, if you talk to somebody at Microsoft, and maybe you know some of them, there's always a reorg happening, right? But Microsoft will treat reorgs as a superpower within the organization. It's actually a reflection of their prioritization exercise, right? So there's a typical kind of cadence that ensures that the org changes. There will be a new org chart. People are moved here. You'll see them leaning more towards 1 or 2, 3, either go-to-market strategies or type of solutions or type of technologies. And typically what you'll find is that people will be moved around to ensure that they're placed in the space that is of utmost importance to the organization. Contrary to that, I find, especially in the startup space and then sometimes in traditional industries, is there's no reorg, right? And things kind of remain the same. And it begs the question around, are you actually optimizing your organization to reflect that which is important to you at that point in time? And sometimes it feels uncomfortable to people. And that's why it's important to structure reorgs and accompany those with super strong communications, right? So org structure and communications cannot live in isolation of each other. So I was using my Microsoft example. Every quarter, we knew there was going to be some shift of some sort. But that shift was always accompanied by some super strong messaging coming from the VP of, your super VP of your organization that says, because of 1, 2, 3, 4, we're now hyper focusing on 1, 2, 3. And so this is the change that has happened as a result of that. And it almost feels like it's like you're weeding out certain things and you're pruning and ensuring that everybody's driving in the same direction. In contrast, and I kind of had forgotten some of the lessons I had learned, I'll give a personal example with my own organization where I looked at it and, I mentioned earlier that we're a data and an AI company, but we have 2 practices, data and AI, and we have a capacity building practice. But when I looked at our organization, I realized it was not reflective of those 2. And yet this is the narrative we keep telling our customers. And I'll explain why. If I look at the front-end sales organization within my organization, in as much as you said we were data and AI and capacity building, the truth is our sellers will sell anything and everything. It's kind of like just go out there and close the business, right? There's a common thought, and I'm sure you've heard it, which is around, ship the org chart, or in some cases, it's like, don't ship the org chart. I feel I belong to the school of thought around shipping the org chart, meaning that you want to ensure that all the way from your front line, whether it's customer success, sales, marketing organization, and so on, that mirrors and goes all the way back into how your product development functions and your engineering is actually working. And for that to happen, I strongly recommend a great level of agility in terms of how you structure your organization and spending a bit more time around that. So to wrap up with my example about Holistic, I got to the point where I asked myself, if capacity building is one of our practices, why don't I have somebody who is a wonderful seller on learning solutions or education? Or something that reflects that, because none of our sellers are. And I can't explain to you why that is. And I think that we've been lucky to do some business in capacity building, but the truth is, in the organization, we're not optimized to deliver against what our priorities are. And so as we wrap up today, I just want to say, you want to think about that piece around your org chart. How does that your organizational structure reflect to what you're building, the solutions you're building? And then how does that impact the way you go to market? It sounds like a light thing, but this is probably going to be one of the biggest levers in terms of allowing you to optimize on the people within your organization. So I'm going to wrap up with a slide around what my lessons are on that, and then we'll go into Q&A. Number one, particularly on org structure, design for trust. And by saying design for trust, what I'll tell you is my experience, I'm sure you agree with this, smaller teams will work more effectively and produce better results because there's almost like by default, because they're a smaller team, higher levels of trust. And because of that, then there's a climate of safety, honesty, people thinking outside the box, no idea is a bad idea, voices are heard. So as you build your organizational structure, think about designing it for trust. Smaller teams that move faster, that can share, that can learn, but create a real environment for openness, honesty, and for ideas to flow, which connects to the second one. Within that context of smaller teams, it almost lends itself to an ability for there to be great conflict. And if you're in a great conflict environment that helps the organization grow, I think it's a fantastic space to be because everyone cannot be agreeable all the time, right? So great conflict, great debate, great discussion. For that to happen, it also means that you need to think about how communication is going on around the smaller teams, around the larger teams across the entire organization. A lot of times, too much communication when what was really needed is maybe increase the types of communication channels you have to enable people to kind of help each other get better. And more importantly, this is a space where you start to see social capital growing within your organization. Number three, in terms of your org chart, optimize for the sharing of knowledge and expertise. So we talked about designing for trust through smaller teams. I strongly recommend that and create them almost like units, right? So we talked about from the frontline sales, customer success, and so on, all the way to product development into engineering. You kind of want to make sure that there's great flow of conversation happening between those teams, right? But you want to make sure then with the right communication channels that the sharing of knowledge is happening across that pipe, but at the same time creating almost a sense of independence and authority for that team within their boundaries. And that's easier said than done. But more importantly, what this then ends up creating is an environment where people don't allow their colleagues to get stuck and lost, right? They really ensure that there's no one isolated, no one's cut off, and everybody's kind of winning together. And the last piece, and I mentioned it earlier, is really the role of social capital within an organization. And I think for me, those three pieces over there, so designing for trust, smaller teams, creating the right communication pipelines across the team, ensuring that you're optimizing for sharing of knowledge and expertise, kind of wrap up or culminate in what you call social capital, right? So those smaller teams that create strong bonds, strong internal cohesion, but is really kind of glued together by trust, helpfulness, courage, people trying things, that's what you kind of want to create within your organization. And I encourage you as we wrap up to just think about your organizational structure today. So if we just look back at what it was like. So we talked about, for example, we started off with key levers. We talked about the key levers being labor, so people. We talked about capital, we talked about code. But today, because we're focusing on people, the idea is not to grow with 20 people every time you sign a new customer up. We're talking about how do you optimize for people. Then we talked about hiring for growth and what should you be thinking of or what roles should you be looking at as your organization continues to mature. We touched on compensation, and I'll share the link if you haven't seen the OK High survey. And I really recommend, I think they just did it out of the goodness of their hearts. It would be great if cohorts, for example, in this space we're talking about InsurTech, if people can come together and put it together and share this information, because for me, that's very specific as to how the startup ecosystem works. And then it starts to create at least some level of parity in terms of how everyone goes out and acquires the right talent. So there's that compensation piece, and I'll share the OK High study. And then we talked about org structure, and we talked about shipping the org chart, and you may disagree with me. I know it's a hot topic sometimes, but I'm a fundamental believer in when you imagine what it is or what problem you're trying to solve for the customer, adjust, mix up, shake up your org chart and optimize for solving that problem. If your org chart looks the same as it did 3 years ago, I guarantee you your org chart is not working for you, right? And there's no right way or wrong way to do this. Ship the org chart, don't ship it. The question is, does your org structure reflect your priorities as an organization? So with that, I'm going to stop there. And we've got 35 minutes for any questions that may come in from the audience. And thank you very much for giving me your attention and listening to me. I hope you can all still hear me, and I haven't been talking to myself for the last hour and a half.
Yes, yeah, you loud and clear.
Good. So any questions, comments? Do you agree, disagree? Okay, I can hear, I think Kevin's talking and somebody else is talking. I couldn't tell who the second person was, but maybe Kevin, you want to go first, and then the other person can go immediately after Kevin.
Okay, let me go first. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. My question is on people and retention of talent, especially now that there's a lot of detachment with this COVID situation where most people are working off the office. And this is a concept that is gaining momentum, especially in Nairobi, where there's the aspect of shared office, where people don't go like to work on every day of the week. So how do we still ensure that we retain the talent that we have, which is so hard to actually acquire during this kind of periods where there's a lot of detachment?
Okay, so I'm of two minds about this conversation, and I almost feel like there were two questions there. The first was, at the end you said period of detachment and how do we retain this talent, right? In my view, my organization, by the way, has been a largely remote organization, and I love it, right? I have to confess and say I'm one of those people who, as soon as the pandemic hit, I moved out of Nairobi and moved to the coast. So I like the whole remote thing. I think it's a wonderful employee value proposition element as well. The ability to be flexible, manage your own time is something that, unless people are very early stage in terms of their career, really works in terms of encouraging people to be endeared to your organization. But there is the question around creating the right level of connection and keeping people connected during this time. And I think that half of that is going to be about your personal style as a leader. And the other half is obviously you have hacks and tools that you can use. The first piece, I think, speaks to ensuring, for me, the first level of ensuring or being able to tell if people are actually engaged is really around the output, the work output that you're getting out of people. And I tend to lean towards being, rather than keeping people on a timer, I prefer results-oriented kind of thinking, in the sense that I don't care when you work or where you work from or how you work. I really care about, these are the 4 things that you committed to delivering, and how are you tracking on those, and do we have the right systems in place that helps track the delivery on that? So I think my first answer to you would be, if you don't have a good system that allows you to track what delivery looks like, whether it's, for example, if it's a sales organization, do you have a CRM, and can you see the traction that's happening in terms of customer engagement? And you can see the deals moving in terms of sales stage, for example. I would say you want to think about some of those things. The second was about personal style. I can share what we've been doing as a company during this period. We have a regular sync that has nothing to do with business and everything to just kind of do with, and we've rotated the hosting of this to different people within the organization to almost create that sense of connectivity with each other, right? So we look at it from the perspective of, how do you create, almost simulate what it would be like to have water cooler conversation, and how do you bring that into the online space? And again, like I said, that depends on you as an individual and down to your personal style. Our style is that we rotate, we have a different person host that specific meeting, and they talk about things they're passionate about. So to give an example, some guy talked about how to run an Airbnb side hustle. I think it was a fantastic presentation and used data to tell his story. How do you bring some of that authenticity into your organization that allows your people to connect with each other in almost a natural way? And I think, honestly, Kevin, you're going to have to step outside of the normal or what you assume happens within the standard office space to create forums for people to be able to engage in that sort of forum, I think. I don't know if I've answered your question, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I hope that that kind of makes sense to you.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, then we had somebody else asking a question, but I wasn't sure who it was. Okay, you can see I've aged. I need my glasses to read. All right, Motisho. How do you increase ownership of the vision product business on employees, especially at the early stage? You know, there's the romantic answer to this, which is that, you know, create the right culture for your people, involve them, and be honestly vulnerable as a leader within your organization as to where you are as a team, where you're going to, what are the roadblocks, what are the challenges, so people feel a sense of ownership. I think the more practical way that people tend to do that is through our very famous stock options, where people feel like they have a stake and they kind of own something, right? So I think it happens kind of within that space. But that's also the romantic answer. Now I'm talking to, and I know there are a few members of my team here, so I almost feel like I shouldn't say this, or maybe I should say it. But I think ultimately every human interaction, whether it's in the context of employer-employee or husband-wife, or whatever the case may be, in my view, is going to be around a relationship of trust. And there's the trust kind of agenda between an employer-employee for me is based on some fundamentals. I'm going to earn a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. I can trust that you've got my back, and I define having my back as 2 or 3 things. Number 1 is being able to give me critical feedback that allows me to grow. Number 2 is looking out for my interests, in the sense that great opportunity in the organization, you gave me great feedback, I've built myself into that, ensure that then I'm in the right position to be able to grow as a career, you know, within my career within the organization. I think that's important in terms of what I want from an organization. And 3, I really want that when I talk to a customer, I'm taking pride in the brand that I belong to, right? And so then it's up to the organization to ensure that the kind of brand that we're building is a brand that your employees can subscribe to, they want to be a part of, and they're proud to be a part of. And being proud of a brand means that it speaks to then excellence within your organization. What are you known for? What do people say about you? So that's what I expect as an employee. As an employer, I'll pay you a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. I will expect that you will bring your all, as in the whole you, the whole body you, to your job every day, right? I'll expect, honestly, that you'll take care of yourself, in the sense that I'm not going to have like eyes at the back of my head to know, you know, you're really feeling depressed about the job, or you're feeling frustrated or whatever. I would appreciate having an open conversation with you around that, so that we deal with issues or dissatisfaction before it gets to the point where it's undealable, right? Meaning that you're walking out of the company. The rest of it, and the glue that brings all of that together for me, is really about trust, is about joint interests. But I will tell you, is that at the end of the day, people will leave you. As an employer, you should know that. And it's okay. In fact, I love this podcast by Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. It's called Masters of Scale. And he oftentimes describes employment almost as a tour of duty. If you think about in the army, they do a tour of duty out to Somalia with AMISOM, or to Afghanistan, or whatever. So your employee will be with you for this period, and they'll grow. And that period could be 20 years like me at Microsoft, or it could be 4 years, or it could be 2 years. And then they'll want to grow somewhere else. And that's okay too, right? Your point is to get ahead of your attrition, to ensure that most attrition happening within your organization is good attrition. In other words, the people who are leaving are the people that you want to leave. And you want to get ahead of bad attrition by even creating networks around yourself, right? So who's a likely place for your employees to go to next? And how do we make sure that maybe I don't know. We have a wonderful cycle between us and you to make sure that it doesn't always feel like you're poaching my people. But I think that the reality of the matter is people will go. And you've got to prepare yourself for it, but you've also got to create the right environment that allows you, both of you, the employer and the employee, to know that it's a tour of duty sometimes. And some people will do the tour of duty for 30 years and others will do it for 3 years. But did we both gain out of this? And that's based on trust. And I know I probably didn't answer your question well enough. I hope I did, but there we go. So David Omato says, how do we balance the conflicting situation where we need to invariably sing to the choir to collaborate with culture set industry actors while upselling and cross-selling, yet avoiding to be everything to everyone? David, I need you to elaborate the question a little bit more for me to be able to answer that, if you don't mind. If you're there and you can unmute yourself and just ask it, that would be wonderful. Sure, go ahead. Hi.
Thank you very much. In our journey, what we have realized as an insurtech startup is we need to collaborate and be non-disruptive, because we are going into a space where incumbents are running the show. So
David, I'm really struggling to hear you. You're breaking up a lot.
At a certain level, and we have many barriers. Yet, in order for us to not to be everything to everyone, find into it.
David, I don't think this is working. I think I've caught less than 25%.
Sorry, sorry. Can you hear me now? Sorry about that. We're having a
yes,
glitch.
now I can hear you a little bit better. Go ahead. Let's see. If I don't, I'll just ask you to reframe the question and type it in. Yeah.
Yes, I was saying in our journey as an insurtech startup, we realized that we need to find our sweet spot where we iterate products to have a product market fit. And therefore, being in this space where we have incumbents who are setting regulations and culture and legacy and all that, we need to find a sweet spot, because in order for us to be an end-to-end product, we need to find to fine-tune product to find where we best have a
Okay, I think we have actually officially lost him. So I'm just going to tell him to reframe the question and type it into the window. In the meantime, do we have any other questions from anybody else, or comments, agree, viscerally disagree? You're welcome to unmute yourself and speak.
Hello, have I come back in?
Yes, you have. But I'm going to ask you to...
I'm so sorry about that. I'm having these glitches. I'm so sorry about that. What I was saying is we are at a position in our company, Orbitcare. We are a revenue, of course, and now we are bootstrapping. And now we need to create several revenue streams. And therefore, in our product offering, we are looking at ways and means of probably upselling, cross-selling, dealing with all manner of industry, legacy holding actors. So the question was, in order for us to be, not to be everything to everyone, how do we find our sweet spot? Is there some magic in how we can find our sweet spot in developing, product in order for us to have the one bit that works in the framework or in the ecosystem and allows us to be a one product entity while we try to iterate and find our product market fit. I don't know if I'm clear on that.
You are, and while it's not directly related or directly as a result of the conversation today, I'll maybe share one or two pieces from my experience. I think what you're trying to do, like you said at the end there, is really establish where your product market fit is and really understand where the right journey to monetization fits for you. I don't think, like you said, you can be everything to everyone. So that's not the way to do it. But I think you would benefit. I think that there's a piece there around being able to test quickly and kind of get your results in and understand what landed, what stuck with customers, what didn't stick with customers. And from a science point of view, it's commonly referred to as a customer discovery process, right? I'm not sure if you've been through any of this, but there's a wonderful gentleman by the name of Steve Blank, type in his website here. And he really does a phenomenal job of breaking down what it looks like to drive a customer discovery process that allows you to understand who your customer is, how do you understand where their pain points are, what's the sweet spot, and then where and how do you align your thinking around your innovation to address that specific sweet spot. I won't go into it in great detail here, but I'll type it into the window. Actually, I'll type it into the window. I'm not sure if a number of you are also familiar with him. You can look him up. I think his website is like steveblank.com, and he's got some wonderful templates that you can use to kind of drive that kind of discovery process around your customer product market fit. Where's the best place for you to play, and how do you then end up monetizing? What I will tell you is that oftentimes you hear people say, get on the floor, like get on the shop floor, get out of your office. A lot of what customer discovery is around or is about is getting out of your office and actually literally engaging with your specific user or your specific potential customer and understanding how to solve for that problem. That's not to say that you haven't done that. And that's why I think that in this case, you may benefit from methodology like what Steve Blank has in place. So please take a look at that. And I would love to discuss this with you. I've typed it into the window. I don't remember his website, but if you look him up, he'll come up, and he's got wonderful toolkits, and it's actually phenomenal to watch. So I would recommend that. Okay. So somebody else, I think it was Eric, who now has his video on, had his hand up. Eric, do you have a question? Nyachai, Eric. And your camera is on, Eric, so we actually can see you. Okay, we will assume that Eric has his camera on and his mic on by mistake. Any other questions from the audience or comments? Okay, I guess we're done. Listen, I'm available for banter, conversation. If anyone was feeling shy, anyone wants to kind of pick my brain on anything, I've typed in my email address into the chat window there. I want to thank you for your time today. I hope it was beneficial to you. Like I said earlier, I know a number of people at different stages of development. And so maybe for some, you all know what I was talking about and maybe agree or disagree. And for others, you don't know what I was talking about. And maybe there was a bit of value there for you as well. Thank you so much for your time this evening. And I look forward to engaging with you again. Have a good night.
Thank you too, and have a good night.
Thank you.